Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at UBC campus. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about a defense of medical assistance in dying from the Downie and Schuklenk paper that's on the syllabus for week 13. So let's dive right into this. So first of all, just a little bit of background to medical assistance in dying in Canada. So the real start of this issue in Canada was a decision in 2015 by the Supreme Court of Canada called Carter versus Canada. And this decision ruled that portions of the criminal code that outlawed all forms of assisted suicide had to be revised. As you might have noticed in the reading, there's some disagreement about exactly what that decision said and didn't say, but for our purposes, the main point is that it led to, in the next year, an act of Parliament called Bill C-14 that it permitted medical assistance in dying provided for conditions, and the last of these conditions will be the most controversial one that we'll talk about the most. So the first is that a person has to be suffering from an incurable illness or disability. The second is that they must be in an advanced state of irreversible decline. And 3, they must be undergoing intolerable suffering. And 4, finally, they must have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And as we see, this is the one that is sort of debated the most in the readings for today. And so that fourth requirement of a reasonably foreseeable natural death was challenged 3 years later in a decision from a lawsuit led by a person named Jean Truchon, who we'll talk about in a moment. And so in this case, Truchon versus Attorney General of Canada and the Attorney General of Quebec ruled that the foreseeable natural death requirement in Bill C-14 was contrary to the Canadian Charter and had to be revised. So the government could have challenged this to the Supreme Court of Canada, but decided not to do that and instead decided to introduce a new bill that would allow the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement to be relaxed. And so this was Bill C-7, passed in 2021 and went into effect in March of 2023. And this bill introduced a 2-track system. So the first track was essentially for cases where there was a reasonably foreseeable natural death, and that functioned more or less like the original BC-14. And then the second track was for folks who didn't have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, and in that case, people were required to wait 90 days, and there were some other requirements related to that, but the key one was the 90-day wait. And so this went into effect in 2023. And part of Bill C-7 was an inclusion of permitting made for cases where the only reason or the sole medical reason to request made was mental illness. And that's been delayed repeatedly. So it was originally delayed until March of 2024 and then delayed again until March of 2027. So at this point, it's getting a little unclear whether this is ever going to go into effect, but that's been highly controversial, and we might discuss that in class as well. Okay, so that's a bit of background. One of the things also that you'll notice is if you engage in controversies or disputes about MAID in Canada is that different examples tend to come up depending on whether a person is in favor of MAID or opposed to MAID. So some examples that are commonly given by people who are in favor of MAID, and in particular in favor of relaxing the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement, are these two examples here. First, Jean Truchon, who suffered from spastic cerebral palsy and had lost the use of his limbs, and he was the lead or the named plaintiff in the Truchon decision. And so after that decision, he was able to receive MAID and chose to have it and died from that in April 2020. Another case, this person was also a plaintiff on the Truchon case. This is Nicole Gladu. Suffered also from sort of an incurable neurodegenerative disease, also a plaintiff in the Truchon case. In her case, even though she could have accessed MAID after the decision, she chose not to and then died of natural causes in 2022. And these are examples that people who are proponents of relaxing the foreseeable natural death requirement will often point to. These are people who really seem to have a strong argument or a strong commitment to wanting to access MAID, and for whom denying this access seemed to be sort of inhumane to them. However, there are also examples that are given by MAID critics, and these are cases where a person didn't have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, and in which allowing MAID in those cases seemed problematic from an ethical standpoint. So one of those is Sophia, and this is an example here. You can, if you click these links, you can read more about this in the media. So these were both cases reported in the media. And so this was an Ontario woman who received MAID after years of fruitless efforts trying to secure housing that would be adequate given her severe allergies to things like cigarettes and cleaning chemicals, and eventually just couldn't get adequate housing, and then ended up pursuing MAID as a result. Notice that this case went into effect before the Track 2 of MAID was actually legally implemented, so this is in a sort of legal gray zone. And that's also true for the next case of Alan Nichols, who was a 61-year-old BC man with a history of depression, who was hospitalized for concerns about suicide in 2019, and then subsequently was a recipient of MAID. And the justifying condition on the form for this was hearing loss. And his family did not know about this until after the fact, and this became a controversial example. So we can talk about that example a bit later too. So in addition, Canada's policies on MAID were an object of criticism by the United Nations. So this is from a report in 2021 by the UN Special Reporter on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this person expressed extreme concern about MAID in Canada, and basically arguing that Bill C-17 did not contain adequate conditions to protect and to ensure viable alternatives to MAID for people with disabilities. So the example of Sophie would be a kind of example that this person is concerned with. The rapporteur also argued that Bill C-7 is inconsistent with human rights standards, and says, in quote here, "In sum, we are deeply concerned that the eligibility criteria set out in Bill C-7 to access medical assistance in dying may be discriminatory in nature or have discriminatory impact, as by singling out the suffering associated with disability as being of a different quality and a kind than any other suffering." So the idea here is that Bill C-7 is essentially saying that people with disabilities sort of have a quality of life that's so low that their life might not be worth living, and the rapporteur is viewing this as a kind of discrimination. So it's against concerns like this that Downie and schuklenk are kind of responding, and they're trying to defend Canada's policy on MAID against criticisms such as that from the special rapporteur from the United Nations. And so one of their arguments is to address concerns about cases where the reasonably foreseeable natural death is not required. And so that's what they're referring to here, and they say proponents of restrictive access regimes, in other words, restricting MAID to cases where someone does have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, they say, ironically contributes to the continuing stigmatization of both disability as well as mental illness. So notice this is sort of the opposite of what the special rapporteur is saying, where the rapporteur is saying that the allowing MAID in these cases increases discrimination. They're saying it's the opposite. So according to Downie and schuklenk, they go on to say, they essentially advocate to remove such patients' agency because they disapprove of the end-of-life choices that some of these patients would predictably make. The kind of strong paternalism, well-intentioned as it may be, that is on display here must be placed where it belongs, in a long tradition of views of disability and mental illness that renders such patients less able than others to make decisions about their lives. So just recall that strong paternalism means restricting someone's freedom for their own good. That's what paternalism is in general. Strong paternalism is when that person is acting according to their considered judgments about what is best for them. So they're not, say, for example, acting impulsively, but they're really acting according to what they have really sat down and thought about and have decided after careful consideration is their best option. And so the case of Jean Chouchon might be an example like that, of someone who's really, this isn't an impulse, he's really acting on something he's thought through very carefully. So this is another thing we can discuss in class about the relationship between paternalism and MAID. In addition, social determinants and disability come up as well, and that was illustrated in the example about Sophie. And in that example, Downey, with regard to that example or similar cases, Downey and schuklenk grant that some people, like Sophia, might be driven by social determinants to request MAID, but they suggest that this is not a good reason to restrict MAID in general, and to restrict MAID to cases where a person has a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And they give two arguments for that we'll look at. The first of these arguments is that individual consent, not vulnerability, should be the key question. So here the idea is that a person's ability to consent is something that's inherent to the individual and is independent of their social circumstances. So this is a quote from the Truchon decision, and it's saying, it is not the person's identification with a group characterized as vulnerable, such as persons with disabilities, indigenous persons, or veterans, that should bring about the need to protect a person who requests medical assistance in dying, but rather that person's individual capacity to understand and consent in a free and informed manner to such a procedure based on his or her specific characteristics. So this is essentially arguing that regardless of a person's vulnerability, that person may have the ability as an individual to consent, and that's really what should matter, not the vulnerability of their situation. For example, in the case of Sophia, of not being able to find adequate housing. The second argument that Downey and schuklenk make in response to concerns about social determinants driving people to request MAID is they say that, well, the same argument would work for all kinds of MAID, including ones where people have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. So they say the argument that people with disabilities or mental illness as their sole underlying medical condition should not have access to MAID unless and until everyone has access to adequate supports and services has an historical antecedent, also rejected by both the Canadian Parliament and the courts. The argument that no one should have access to MAID unless and until everyone can access palliative care in a timely fashion when they could benefit from it. In other words, the idea is that if you look at cases where people have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, some of those people who are requesting MAID might request MAID because they can't access adequate palliative care and they're in terrible pain, and that's why they're requesting MAID. So notice this is an argument that illustrates relative proportionality. It's saying, well, look, you wouldn't want to ban MAID across the board, but if you follow this argument about social determinants, that's what it would lead to. So therefore, that should be a reason to reject the argument from social determinants. So finally, Downey and schuklenk address this question of slippery slopes, which was in the title of their article, and also, of course, is one of the main themes in the other reading for this week. And a slippery slope, as I'll explain in the next lecture, is essentially the idea that by allowing something that's justifiable in some cases, so assuming we all agree that there's some cases where MAID is justifiable, that might lead step by step down into cases where MAID is definitely not justifiable. And so Downey and schuklenk have two sort of arguments against slippery slopes as a serious consideration or worry for MAID in Canada. First is that they say, well, there's really no evidence of slippery slopes in other countries with expansive MAID policies. This would include like the Netherlands or Belgium, and they say, look, these other countries have done similar policies as Canada, and in these lawsuits, the judges looked carefully at the relevant evidence about those countries and didn't find any real evidence of a slippery slope, so there's no reason to think that would happen in Canada either. The other argument that they make is that the Carter decision, or the one back from 2015 that sort of prompted the change in medical assistance dying policy in Canada, that they argue that this already permitted MAID for cases in which mental health is the sole reason and for cases in which there was no reasonably foreseeable natural death. And so they argue that extending MAID to these to these cases is not an expansion beyond what was originally intended. So again, they argue there's no evidence of a slippery slope. All right, so I'll end this lecture here, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.